Today we have Matt from likeim5.com to explain how to automate some simple tasks with Python and maybe replace Zapier with it. So let's get started.
We're basically going to take the workflow that I use for whenever a new student signs up for a new course in Teachable and then springs to action a bunch of other steps like having to take that student, add them to my Mailchimp account, send myself a Slack message to say, hey, Matt, someone signed up for your course. Awesome job. And then finally to add that student's information to a Google Sheet. We're going to walk through all those steps on my own, which the inspiration for this is that this is an actual project I did a few weeks ago, which saved me $50 a month on my Zapier plan. So we'll walk through how to do this all together. And then by the end of this, my goal is that you're going to be able to learn how to do all these business automations on your own. So if you even want to take it a step further, you can code any other connection on top of the 4 that I mentioned. So we're just going to start by walking through how I currently use Zapier to code these automations. I'm going to talk a little bit about webhooks and APIs, which might be a new concept, might not. Together, we're going to set up a Replit environment to actually write our code. Big fan of Replit, and I'm going to explain more why in a little bit. We'll finally go and actually create a webhook, again, talking through what a webhook is, to get that data from Teachable whenever a new student signs up. We'll add that student to Mailchimp. We'll send a Slack message. We'll add that student data to Google Sheets. And by the end of it, like I said, my goal is that you'll be able to apply all this code to automate your own connections. So I'm so excited to get started. Let's just dive right in. Before we write this code to replace Zapier, let's actually just first talk about what Zapier is doing for us. And one thing I want to be really clear about is that I love Zapier. Zapier is an amazing service. It takes all these different systems that don't really talk to each other. It's not like Teachable and Slack have a native integration. And it says, you know what, we don't care. We can just figure out how to connect them ourselves. And so it takes these different services, has one action, in my case, a student signing up for a new course on Teachable, which triggers a whole bunch of other actions. It says, hey, let's take the student's information, add them to Mailchimp, send a message in Slack, add a row in a Google Sheet, no problem at all. And that's exactly what the workflow is. There's one action here, a student signing up for a course in Teachable that triggers these 3 other actions, a student being added to Mailchimp so I can send an email to them, a student's information being added to Slack so I can send a message to myself saying, hey, this student signed up. And finally, a student, that row about that student being added to a new Google Sheet that I'm setting up. And just to see how this works in Zapier, you'll notice that, again, my love fest for Zapier is continuing. It's pretty seamless. So really, in just a few steps, what you can do is you can say, great, there's this one service that I want to start the trigger with. My mouse is doing funny things on my computer and not showing up. But so there's a new enrollment in Teachable. Then if it's a paid person, that's what this particular course and Zap is doing. Then it's going to add them to Mailchimp. It's going to send a message in Slack, and it's going to create a row in Spreadsheet. And so it's pretty simple. It's not that hard to do it in Zapier, but it's also not that hard to just code it ourselves. Because what we'll notice is that we can do this, but you do pay pretty heavily for Zapier to do all this for you. For me, it cost me $50 a month just for Zapier to have the pleasure of connecting these 4 different services. And instead, what we're going to do this afternoon is we're just going to, in 250 lines of code, maybe even less, figure out how to connect all these different services ourselves. So now that we've talked through what we've done in Zapier, let's just quickly take one more pause before we start coding and talk about webhooks and APIs just so we're on the same page for those. One more pause before we actually start writing code. I just want to explain 2 very closely related concepts of APIs and webhooks. Now, APIs let you access data from the services that you use. And just as a quick analogy of how it works and maybe why it's helpful, my companies would even let you do this in the first place. I kind of think of APIs like giving a neighbor a key to your house. So the way it's going to work is that you have to personally authorize that individual person, your neighbor, to be someone that you trust with your key. So you're going to give them a key, and then that key allows them to perform specific tasks. Let's say that you go away for the weekend, you want them to water your plants. You can text your neighbor and say, hey, can you please go in my apartment and do this? And now they can go in and perform that specific task, assuming that they're not going to use that key for anything else. And it's very similar with APIs. So what we'll see in a little bit when we actually start working with APIs is that, for example, when we use Mailchimp's API to add student data to Mailchimp, we're going to have to go in and authorize the Mailchimp API as the person that has access to our actual account. That's something that we're going to figure out how to do. And then Mailchimp says, hey, now that you've actually been authorized to use us and to interact with this specific account, you now have access to certain functionality. You can add new users to that account. You can update the tags for a member in that account. You can do all these different tasks now that you've been authorized. And so we'll walk through how to read the API documentation, how to actually access it, and really how to use it for the few specific services that we're talking about today. And just, I guess, thinking about why a company like Mailchimp would even do this in the first place, I like to think of it as Mailchimp providing additional services on top of Mailchimp itself. By making it easier to actually get data into Mailchimp and interact with it as a developer, you're kind of building a moat around your product, and you're creating this avenue for additional integration such that Teachable doesn't have to natively work with Mailchimp and automatically add new members to Mailchimp, but you could still, with pretty easy tools, which is what we'll see today, connect the two and just create additional value by making these other services interact more directly with Mailchimp. And webhooks are pretty similar, but slightly different. So webhooks get triggered when a certain action occurs, and that action will then usually trigger other actions. So the way that I kind of think of it is that webhooks are like personal assistants that are always activated. They're just listening out for a specific action to occur, and then they will all of a sudden spring to action and do something. And the way that we're going to think of this is that when a new student signs up for a course on Teachable, we don't know exactly when that's going to be. It could be at 3 p.m., it could be at 4 p.m., but we just want this webhook to be constantly alert to the fact that students can sign up for a new course. And then the second that they do sign up for a new course, we want them to then go do all these other things. We want them to then go and take that information, add it to Mailchimp for that student, send a Slack message, and add information about that student to a Google Sheet. It doesn't know when it needs to work, but it just knows that the second that it gets called on, it has to do something. And so here's a quick outline of what we're going to do together. We're going to first start by creating a webhook in Teachable, which is something that they allow us to do, to listen for a student signing up for a course. And then taking it one step further, we're actually going to see that we're going to create a webhook in our own Replit environment, our own coding environment, so that we don't necessarily know, also kind of like Teachable, when a new student's going to sign up for a course, but it doesn't matter because we're going to write all the code ourselves to whenever a student signs up, just add them to Mailchimp, send a Slack message, and add their data to the Google Sheets API. And so it doesn't really matter. It's just going to say, hey, whenever you're ready, here's all the code. It's going to be ready to rock, and it will run as soon as a new student signs up. We'll then take that information, we'll add it to Mailchimp through their API. We'll also interact with the Slack API and their webhook functionality to be able to send a Slack message to a specific Slack workspace. And finally, we'll just add student information to a Google Sheet. So now that we've walked through a little bit at a high level how APIs work, how webhooks work, and what they are, let's now just start setting up our coding environment and get rocking. So I will see you on the other side where we will set up our Replit environment. So now that we've walked through all the steps of what we're going to be coding, we've talked through webhooks and APIs, let's start setting up our coding environment. We're going to do that using Replit. So maybe you've used Replit before, maybe you haven't. It was personally a mind-blowing experience when I used it, and I'm going to use it going forward. But if you haven't, then kind of in the same way that you would write essays in Word or crunch spreadsheets in Excel, maybe make some slides in PowerPoint, you would code in Replit. Replit just makes it super easy to open it up, start coding, have everything that you need right there. It is really, truly incredible. I found personally that it's the fastest and simplest way to get started, and I use it now as my default way to code in Python. Now, what we're going to do to actually get started is we're going to fork my Replit REPL that I created for this specific course, which is going to be at replit.com/@mapblank/lif-automations-course. Don't need to type that out on your own. You can just get this below this video, but I'll show you what it looks like if you actually were to go to that page. You should see something that looks just like this. And now for me, if I already have an account, so I'm not going to go ahead and do this, but if my mouse were to cooperate and show up, great. What you do is you can click this fork button right here. If you already have an account, you can log in and it'll let you just fork it into your own environment. If you don't, then you can sign up for an account pretty easily here. It's totally free. But what you'll see is that you now have access to all the code that I've authorized you to start with for this specific course. So once you open up the REPL that I shared with you, you should see exactly what I'm seeing on my computer screen. You should see an environment with a few different Python files in here, this main.py file, Google Sheets.py, Mailchimp.py, settings.py, Slack.py, teachable webhooks.py. along with some project packager files. But I'll just take a couple minutes to walk through exactly what's going on in Replit, and then we'll start setting up our code to actually get going. This main.py file is going to be something that's native to every single REPL that you ever work with. This is going to be the main file that runs when you run your REPL. So here, if I were to press Command Enter to run this, then it's going to start activating my Replit environment here and importing all the different packages that I have and I've already just decided for you that are going to be in here. So that's cool on its own, is that you can just go from basically 0 to coding and then running your code all in the same environment very quickly. And what's already in here is just some documentation on some of the steps that we're going to do together. So for example, when we work with the Google Sheets.py file, here's the name of the method that I'm going to write, a summary of what it's going to do, some parameters that it's going to take, steps to actually accomplish this, and API documentation for what we're actually going to be using to interact with those specific APIs. And to start, you'll notice that this main.py file is especially filled out. This is containing personally a webhook that we're going to be using so that anytime a new student signs up for a course on Teachable, it's going to ping this webhook that we've created here and say, hey, it's time for you to start doing things. It's time for you to add student information to Mailchimp. It's time for you to send a Slack message. And it's time for you to add that student's data to Google Sheets. I'm not going to make you recreate this on your own. So I gave it to you here. It uses a package in Python called Flask, and specifically the Flask RESTful API. But it's currently just providing this one, home directory, and then two, an endpoint called Teachable New Enrollment, which is going to be at the API/Teachable/New Enrollment endpoint that's going to do things for us. It's going to run all that code that will ultimately get our code to run and add data to Mailchimp, Slack, and Google Sheets once we get it to run. And as soon as this finishes running, what we'll see is that we can actually set up this Teachable API, this Teachable webhook, to actually ping our webhook whenever a new student signs up for an account. And so what we'll do is I'm going to wait for this to continue running, but I'm going to also just show you how this is going to look in Teachable while that's happening. So in Teachable, you may be using this for Teachable, you may be using this to create these automations for some other service, but Teachable pretty natively lets you have this in the settings, and then webhooks. You can create a new webhook, which for us is going to be for a new enrollment, and I'm going to send that as JSON data. And as soon as this is done running, we're going to see that we're going to have this new URL that we're going to be able to host our API on in order to hit it through Teachable. So I'm going to wait for that to run, which should be happening in a second. And we now have this endpoint here that's, or this base URL here that is LAIF-automations-course-start. That's what I called mine, .matblank.repl.co, which we can use as the base URL here, so that whenever we actually get a student to sign up for a new course, it's going to hit this specific endpoint, this LIAF automations course start, and it's going to then run all the code in here. And the code that it's going to run is currently that it's only going to take the data that we're collecting through the API endpoint, and we're pretty much just going to print it out to start. Now, I don't want to actually have a student sign up through Teachable and to just illustrate this. So the way that I'm cheating and doing this on my own is that I'm using a different application here called Postman to simplify this for us. So what Postman allows you to do is it allows you to run API requests against a specific URL and pass in specific data that we want it to use. And so really what we're using it for in layman's English is just to simulate what it looks like when someone actually signs up for a new course in Teachable by taking the data that Teachable would have sent us if a new student were to sign up. In my case, this is for a student named Matt Blank, which happens to be me. And we're going to send that data to a specific URL. That URL is going to be the same URL that we just used to create this webhook. So I'm going to go in and copy and paste it, really just to simulate what would be happening if a new student were to sign up in Teachable. And what we should see if we actually run this, especially here, is that it's going to print out, hopefully, that data that we just passed in through the API, this data right here. So now what we should see is exactly that we're going to have this data, this data about this new person who just signed up, is now going to print out. But it's not just that we want that data print out. We actually want to create some method that's then going to cause that data to be added to Mailchimp, that data to be creating a Slack message for us, and then that data to be adding to a Google Sheet. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go to this teachable webhooks.py file, if I do this correctly, and we'll see that we have this method that it wants us to create, this course enrollment method, which is going to take this data that it's going to be receiving as a parameter, and it's going to get the pertinent data from the webhook that we created. It's then going to take that user's information, add them to Mailchimp, send a message in Slack, and add data through the Google Sheet API. So what I'll do here is let's actually just go ahead and start to code this. I'm going to say def course enrollment, which is the name of the course enrollment method, which is going to take in data as a parameter. And what we're going to do with that data is we're going to first just take that data that we found here, and I had already coded this for us. It's not super important, but we're basically going to take it and parse the information for the information that we need for our purposes. That's what this parse enrollment data method is going to be doing. So I'm going to say, let's just copy these steps down. I'm going to press Command right square bracket to move that one indent to the right, Command slash to comment all that out. I'm going to highlight one of the comments. I'm going to move them down. And to get the pertinent data from the webhook, which is just what this parse enrollment data method is doing, we're going to say course enrollment data is going to be equal to the method that's going to parse the enrollment data, and we're going to pass the data to that. Cool. And maybe at the very end, we'll just return course enrollment data. So now whenever we run this method, it's going to eventually add tags to our lecture completion data, which we're going to use as part of our Mailchimp method. We're going to send a message in Slack, and we're going to update our data in a Google Sheet. But for now, it's really just going to parse that information. So what we can do now is we can go back to main.py. And what I want to do is I want to import this method from teachable webhooks.py so we can actually use it here. So I'm going to say import the course enrollment, which I'll copy and paste, method from teachable webhooks.py. And then I'll say from teachable webhooks, import, do it this way, course enrollment. And now what we can do with this specific data is we could say, okay, now let's take the data and let's create a new response. We'll say run the code for new enrollment. Ooh, for course enrollment. So course enrollment, we're going to take the course enrollment method, which takes a data parameter, which we can see here. And let's say that we create a new variable called response. That's going to be the result of course enrollment data. That should be the parsed down data from what we found here. And we can even just print out response just to see what that looks like. I'm going to run our code again by pressing Command return, Command enter. We'll even print it this way. Say print, create a new line, new enrollment, maybe we want to return the JSON version, which is specific to Flask version of that response. Let me actually run this one more time. And now what we should see as soon as this goes back to red and it finishes running is that when we run Postman one more time, we actually get just this parsed down information to print out for us. We get the student name, which is Matt blank, my first name, Matt, last name blank, my email, etc. So we have all this information. And so now what we could do is every single time our webhook gets hit, it's currently just parsing the information that we want and returning it and printing it out. But what we'll see over the subsequent videos is that we can actually take that a few steps further and not only get that data and parse it, but also start to use the Mailchimp API to add data to Mailchimp, send a message in Slack, update data in Google Sheets. We can really use it to code whatever we want. So over the next few minutes, we're going to go through all the steps to add new students to Mailchimp through their API. And in this first couple minutes, we're just going to walk through exactly what the steps are that we're going to go through in our code and what it looks like in Mailchimp's API to actually accomplish the steps that we need. After that, we're actually going to write the code. But first, just to start off, I defined all the documentation here so that you can just get started pretty easily. So what we'll do together is we'll create a new method called add student. You could call it add student to Mailchimp, anything you want. This is what I'm going to call it. And what it's going to do is it's going to add or update a student information within Mailchimp. It's going to take a parameter called student data. That's the data that we're getting from Teachable about the student that we're working with. And we're going to start by creating a version of the Mailchimp API that's going to interact with our account specifically. If you remember back to what I was talking about when I opened up by discussing APIs and how they work, we basically need to tell Mailchimp that, hey, we are authorized to use the exact account that we want to add this student to. And Mailchimp's going to say, great, go right ahead, use our API to add students to this specific account. So it's not like I'm going to be actually managing someone else's account that I don't want access to. The next thing that we're going to do is we need to tell Mailchimp which list or audience we actually want to add that student to. Mailchimp allows you to have multiple audiences within their system. And what you'll see here is that for me, I just really have one. So the way that I can find what that list ID is to specify where I want to add the student to is you can go to the audience dashboard. If you're following along in Mailchimp, then go to this top right portion where it says manage audience and go to settings. And I'm not actually going to click this because I don't want to expose what my list ID is. I don't want to expose some of my data, but you're just going to go to audience name and default, and it's going to show up right to the right. So I would just keep note of that list ID. I would copy it. And one thing that Replit does that's really nice is they allow you to store secret information in Replit so that we can then use it within our code. So for example, I have my Mailchimp list ID right here. I can create a variable name for it and store the value of it in here. And I'm going to go over how to actually access that list ID and get that variable in our code as we actually write the code. The next thing that we need to do is we need to package all the data together so that we can actually add that member to Mailchimp in the way that Mailchimp wants us to add that data. And just to start going through the API documentation, one of which I offered was the actual official Mailchimp API documentation, which I'll show you in a second. And then also, typically, there's either a Python-specific version of the API that either Mailchimp or any company will come out with directly, or that other very nice people made in order to make it very easy to interact with the official API through Python. I'll show you that as well. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing two things. We're first going to be adding that student to Mailchimp or updating them if they already exist in our Mailchimp account. And then we're going to add the right tags that we need for that student to be able to say that this particular student signed up for this particular course. We're going to tag them in a certain way, which is how I treat my data. So just going through the official API documentation, we really just need two different methods from Mailchimp. We just need the method to actually update or add a new member, which is this add or update list member function. And we need one that says that we can add or remove member tags from that member. And so just to get a little sense of what information we're going to need for each student, because that's how we're going to create the payload to actually add that student to Mailchimp, we need a few things. We need that list ID that I discussed. We need a subscriber hash, which is really just the email for the member that for the student we're going to be adding. And we need a couple more things. We need the email address, which again, we just use as the hash, and then status of the member if new. So Mailchimp allows you to tag a student with a particular status. So you can say they're subscribed to your Mailchimp account or unsubscribed. We'll default by just saying that they're subscribed, but I'll walk through exactly when we write the code what that looks like. Similarly, for adding new tags to a member, let's say we want to tag a member as signing up for a very specific course, which we'll get information about from Teachable, then again, we just need a few things. We need the list ID that we're going to add the student to. We need the subscriber hash, which is their email. We need, and then a little bit other data, where'd this go? And then the tags that we're actually going to tag that student with. And just to see what it's going to look like, because we're not going to do this through the official Mailchimp API, I'm going to cheat a little bit and use the Python Mailchimp API that someone else created. We're going to first initialize our API by importing Mailchimp 3, which is the API, into our code. And then we're going to create a new Mailchimp client, which allows us to interact with our account specifically by giving them our Mailchimp API key and our Mailchimp username. which again, if you want to go and figure out that information, let me just move my head out of the way. Going to this bottom left indicator, clicking on account. And again, I'm not actually going to click on it to expose my API key, but once here, you can go to extras, API keys, copy that information. And again, what I did personally is that I created a Mailchimp username, which is the username I used to log in, and Mailchimp API key variables in here that we're going to be able to extract and get into our code. So now that we've walked through all the steps that we're going to be taking with Mailchimp, let's go ahead and actually write the code to do it. So now let's actually go ahead and write the code to add each student to Mailchimp. And just to see if it works at the end, once our code finally runs, I just want to first take a second and go back to the data that we're actually going to be adding to Mailchimp through the API. So I'm going to be adding data to my own self in Mailchimp. I do already exist in my own Mailchimp account, but just to confirm that, I'm going to be adding data for the email mattblank11@gmail.com, which this is the member here. And as we actually run the code, we should see that a lot of these different tags for myself, like me, Matt, will actually start to update and start to accumulate new data that we're going to be adding through the API. So that's just one thing I'm going to call out is as we're testing this, this is going to be our check. We're going to go back at the very end and see, does Matt Blank actually have all the information that we added to his profile? Or my profile, I should say. So first, let's go ahead and start writing this code. So I'm going to define a new method that I'm going to call add student. And this new method is going to take a parameter that's called student data. And to this method, I'm going to add just the steps for the documentation that we're going to run. So I'm going to write that. I'm going to first indent this by highlighting all the levels we want to indent. I'll do command and then the right square bracket, which pushes everything one to the right. I'm going to highlight everything again, and I'm going to press command / to make every one of those pieces of text a comment. So now it's all commented out through our code. And just to make this legible, I'll create a couple different spaces, and we're just going to attack this one by one. So if you remember, we had to go through our code and we had to actually initialize our API by importing Mailchimp into our code as something that we can actually run, which if you look at settings.py, is something that I've already done for us. And because we're importing everything from settings, it's already done for us. And the next thing we need to do is we need to create an instance of the Mailchimp API that's authorized to add data to our specific account by passing in our API key and username. So I'm basically going to copy and paste this and create, shift it over, and create a new instance of the Mailchimp API that's authorized to work with our settings. And they kind of put in these filler words of your API key and your username, but we want to use our own actual API key and our actual username. And the way that I had mentioned that we solved for this in Replit is I want to be able to use this and I want to be able to share this code with you. And I'm sure that you potentially want to do the same, where you want to keep this data for yourself and not really expose any of the information like your own personal API key. So what I can do is I can go back to those secret pieces of information that we had, like the Mailchimp API key and the Mailchimp username. And let me move my head out of the way. I'll write the code for this, but they make it really easy to add each new variable that we've stored over here into our code without exposing to anyone else who looks at our code what our actual value is. The way that we can do that is we can import this package for our operating system, which I've already gone ahead and done for us. You can check that in your settings. And we can access the specific variable that we want to add. So we can say, hey, I want to add, for example, my Mailchimp API key right here, which this is my Mailchimp API key. I can insert it. And the part that's important in this is this os.environ Mailchimp API key. What that's saying is that in the operating system of our computer, really in this case in Replit, we've stored an environment variable, which is only specific to our personal environment, not to anyone else's. No one else can see this, with a variable name called Mailchimp API key that stores the value of our actual API key. And I'm going to do the same thing for the Mailchimp username, which I called, I believe, Mailchimp username. Yeah. Cool. And so what we would see is now we've actually added our Mailchimp API key and our username to our client, and now it's going to be able to run. You actually don't need to specify this as the MC API or MC user because they're just ordered correctly. But the next thing we're going to do is, because we need, and which we saw earlier, we need to add the list ID to Mailchimp's API and actually to add the user or the student to the correct list. We need to get the list ID for the list ID for the list we want to add the student to. So again, similar thing. I created a new variable in our environment called Mailchimp list ID, which I'm going to access here by saying list ID equals os.environ Mailchimp list ID. Cool. Okay, so now we have an instantiation of the Mailchimp API that's authorized for us to add data to our specific account. We have the list ID that we're actually going to add that member to. And now we want to create a payload for the member that we're actually going to add all that student's information to. And from there, we're going to take that information, we're going to actually add it for that student through the API. And if you look at what we're actually going to need here, what that payload is going to look like, so of course we're going to need a list ID and the subscriber hash. That has to do with the student's email address. And there are certain other characteristics that we're going to need to add to our code, like the student's email address, their status if they're a new member of our list. We can add other features, like we can add a status for the member. We can add a merge field. Merge field would include something like our first name and last name, which is something that we're going to want to include. Interest, language, VIP location. There are a lot of different options that Mailchimp gives us. What we're going to do specifically is we're going to add a few things. We're going to add the email address. Let me go back up. And the status if new, like they give us. And then we're going to add a couple things on top of that. We're going to add the status, which will just say that they're subscribed or unsubscribed or clean, pending, transactional. And then we're going to add a few merge fields. I'm going to add their first name and their last name. So let's go ahead and write the code to get that payloaded now. I'm going to call this something like member data. And this member data is going to be a dictionary, which is going to include a couple things. It's going to be the email address, which is something we saw earlier. And that email address is going to come from our student data where we already got the student email. We're going to add a new field. We're going to call this status if new. We're going to call that subscribed. We just want them to be subscribed to our list if that's the case. The next thing is the status. And normally what I would say is that we should take an extra step and we should probably figure out, okay, well, if this member already exists, kind of like how I already exist in Mailchimp, then we want to not just create a new member and override all their features by saying this person is definitely subscribed, but maybe this person already exists and they happen to have unsubscribed from all our emails. So we should, in a more dynamic way, figure out what the status of the student actually is if they already exist in Mailchimp. For now, we're just going to say that they're subscribed just for the sake of simplicity, but just know that you can always make this a little bit fancier. And then the last thing that we need to add are merge fields, which are going to take the form of a dictionary as well. We're going to add the first name, which Mailchimp already has for us as the F name in all caps. And I'm going to get that as the student data, student first name. And then secondly, I'm going to add the L name, the last name, which is going to be very similar. It's going to be the student data's student last name, which is something that, as I've shown you earlier, we already have in here. Great. So this is the way that the data is going to be structured. We're going to add all this data to Mailchimp through their API. And so now we actually want to use Mailchimp's API to add information about that student through the API. And what this is going to look like, I'll just show you through the Python Mailchimp library. I'm going to search for list members and find this. We're going to use their list members create or update method in order to add a student to a particular list ID with a particular subscriber hash, including the data that we want for that member. And so I'm just going to actually copy and paste this. As you'll see, we've nicely already called our Mailchimp client the client, which is what it looks like here. I'm just going to clean this up a little bit so it's a little bit easier to read. Cool. Great. So we want to add the student to the particular list ID, which we've already gotten. We want to add the student hash, which is the student data student email. And the data that we want to add for that particular student is what we just did, which is the member data. We're going to call this student data, member data, whatever it is. So now that we've written this code, we want to make sure that it's actually working. We probably want to pause as we go, maybe even more regularly than I've already been doing, just to make sure that the code that we wrote actually works. And what I mentioned up front is that we're going to check to see if the code actually works by seeing if the data that we're adding here, that we're adding for each student, is working by adding the data for myself from mattblank11@gmail.com, and then checking to see if that data actually got updated within Mailchimp. And so again, I don't have any tags aside from me, which I just signify to myself that I am me. And so in order to test this, we need to do two quick steps. One is, as we can see from our API endpoint, this webhook that we had created, it's going to be running this course enrollment method from Teachable webhooks in order to run all our code. And right now, all that code does is it just parses the enrollment data that we got from Teachable and it gets the right information that we need. But now we want to take that information and actually add it for each student to Mailchimp. So in order to actually run the code from Mailchimp, we need to first take that method that we wrote in Mailchimp.py and import it here. So I'm going to go to the very top and I'm going to say from Mailchimp, which is the Mailchimp.py file. We don't have to specify .py. I want to import. I'm going to do it this way just to clean it up, and also just in case we want to add more methods in the future, I want to say let's add in our add student method. That's the method that we just wrote in here, add student. And now that we actually added add student into our file, we want to run the add student method to add data for that student. So let's say add student, and we want to add that student with certain information. That information we want to add is the course enrollment data. Great. And so now what this is going to do is it's going to not just run our code and parse the right information for us, but it's going to add the student in Mailchimp using that method that we just created, and hopefully it's going to run properly by first just creating or updating that member. And now if we go to Postman and run it, let's go ahead. I'll press Command Enter within Postman. It looks like it ran properly. And if I go back to my file, we might not actually notice any differences because we really just added my first and last name, but it looks like it did run properly. I'm subscribed, and my first name Matt, last name blank. We'll see in a second once we add our tags that we actually have gone ahead and tapped into the Mailchimp API properly. And what we'll do to actually add those tags to the student is also, again, go back to our teachable webhooks.py file to add the tags to our course enrollment data here, just so that we can then add it to our student information and then use the Mailchimp's add tags API feature to add tags for a particular student. And just to look at the API at what it actually looks like in order to create add tags for a member, it looks like we need a couple pieces of information. We first need the list ID and the subscriber hash, just like we needed to add a student or update their information to Mailchimp. And we need one more feature, which is tags. We need all the information about those tags. And these tags look like a list of dictionaries where each dictionary contains a name, the name of the tag, and the status, whether that tag is active or inactive. So inactive, it'll shut off the tag for that member, and active, it'll activate it, it'll turn it on. So hopefully what we should see here is that once we add tag data for this member, and then we add the tags within the Mailchimp API, that we should see when we go back to my account here that I have more tags added. So let's go ahead and add this tag information to our data. So we'll say course enrollment data. I'm going to call this tags. It's going to be equal to a dictionary where we're going to add, where it's a list of dictionaries where we're going to add first a name, and then I believe it's a status. Let me double check that. And a status, cool. Okay, and I want to add personally 3 different tags to our data here when a new member signs up. I want to add the course that they signed up for as a tag, just in case I want to send out a newsletter or something to people who signed up for a specific course. The second thing that I want to add is I want to add that this person has not yet started the course. I'm going to, in a later video series, follow up and show you how to create a drip campaign where if you want to reach out to individual students who have not yet started a course or get them to try signing up for a new course, then we'll be able to set up a drip campaign to hopefully change that behavior and get them to take some lectures. But we'll add that as well. And then the final thing that we'll add is that this person is a new sign up. And a lot of this, you could add whatever you want, but it's more just illustrative of what you can add as tags. So first I'm going to say that the name, the first tag that we want to add is the name of the course that they signed up for, which comes from our enrollment data through the course name. So I'm going to say this is the course enrollment data course name. We want that to be active. Now I'm going to add a new one, which we can call it something like not started, because again, I want to start emailing people who have not yet started their course, and I want that to be active as well. The way that I got this to show up is and duplicate is I hovered over the text I want to duplicate, and I'm pressing Shift Option down to get this to replicate below. And then the final thing that I want this to show is new sign up, should be the final thing. And so now when we add this course enrollment data to the add student method, it's going to also pass along these tags. And what we can do is, going back to our Python version of the API here, let's find the tags. So what we want to do is we want to update the tags for an individual member through the Mailchimp client. And so I'm going to go back to Mailchimp.py, and I'm going to write the code to add tags for a particular student. Again, cleaning this up. Let's see. So we want to add student to the right list ID, and subscriber hash, which I'll just copy and paste from above. And the data that we want to add is we want to add the tags for that individual student. And so I'm going to say that we want to add the tags, which is how it shows up here. We want to add tags as a body parameter. And the tags we want to add are the student data tags, which these are the tags that we had specified over here. And now if we were to run our code one more time, what we should see is that this is going to run properly. And now if we go back to map blank 11, we should see that all those tags, the new sign up, the not started, and the data analysis course that I signed up for, are now all included as tags in my profile, which just proves to us that what we wrote and what we ran is going well. It's running properly. So again, there's some steps we can do to make this fancier. We can add more tags, we can change the tags, we can add some more information about each student, but this is a really great place to start, just to be able to figure out how to write the functionality to take information from Teachable and then automatically, in the same way that Zapier would, add each student to Mailchimp in a dynamic way. In the next video, what we're going to walk through is how to actually now notify myself that a new student signed up, so that when someone actually signs up through Teachable, it notifies me through Slack and says, hey, you got a new sign up, awesome job. I'll see you in the next video where we'll start talking about Slack's API and how to solve that. So now that we've written the code to add a student to Mailchimp, let's go ahead and write the code to send a message through Slack. And before we actually write the code, let's just walk through exactly what we're going to be building together. So we're going to be using Slack's API, which I'm going to touch on in a second, to take a specific message and send that message to a specific Slack workspace. I personally have a Like IM5 workspace. It just is going to send a message to a particular channel with a particular message. And the way this is going to work is we're first going to create a message, which I wrote a method called create Slack message, which, just to cheat a little bit and show you what that actually looks like, is going to announce that there is a course enrollment to the channel with a name, email, course, and amount listed, which we're going to take from that student data that we've created earlier. And you don't really need to understand exactly how this is going to work, but I wrote the functionality to actually get that to run. And we need to authorize our Slack API, the Slack API, to work with our code in order to actually send a message to the workspace that we've authorized. And the way it's going to work, I've included some documentation here, is we're going to send a message through the Slack webhook, which there is one, at a particular URL, which is going to contain basically the authorized information about our specific workspace. with a particular message. So kind of like how we had done it earlier from Mailchimp, we're going to go through a little bit of the same process. And if you go here to the link that I shared, we're going to need to do a couple of things, which I'm going to let you do on your own because I've already done and it's pretty well documented through Slack. So we're going to first create a Slack app, which if you click that link, will take you to a page where you create an app. I've already done that, and I've added the feature and functionality to enable it to run against the incoming webhook. Then we're going to install our app by integrating it into our workspace. And then finally, once we've done that, we're going to get a specific URL that we're going to hit whenever we want to send a message to our particular workspace that we've authorized. I'm not going to scroll down because that particular URL contains information about like your secret information about your workspace. I don't want to expose that, so I'm not going to scroll down further, but I would copy and paste that URL as a file or a variable here, which I've called Slack URL. And so as we get going, it's really not much more difficult than just creating a message that we want to send and then going to the Slack webhook URL and running a post request to actually send the message that we want to that URL, which is then going to send the message to our workspace. We'll walk through exactly what that looks like and how it works in the next video, but just want to take a second and walk through the steps. Now that we've walked through how to send a message through Slack's API, let's actually write the code to do it. So right beneath this documentation, I'm just going to define a new method, which I'm going to call post to Slack, which again, you can call whatever you want. You can write it post, anything, and that's going to take a message as a parameter because we're going to send a specific message to Slack. And the steps that we're going to actually take to send that message is that we're going to first create a payload with that message. And I guess you can just trust that I have written this correctly, but this is exactly how Slack is going to take our code to run a message, to send a message. And we're first going to create that payload. I'm going to create a new variable called payload. And that payload is going to be a dictionary with a value called text and a key called text and a value called message. And I'm not going to actually scroll down further just to show you what it looks like. But as you can see toward the bottom here, this post request is going to take a specific content type of JSON, and it's going to take a dictionary with text as a key and the message as a value. So now we're going to get the URL for our Slack workspace. I'm going to call this new variable URL. That's going to be an environment variable that we've stored or you will store that I personally called Slack URL. So now we have the URL that we're actually going to send this message to, which once you see your URL, you're going to see that certain secret pieces of information for your Slack workspace are included there. So I'm going to hide it here just so you don't see it and get exposed to it. And the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to create a post request, which if we click on settings, you can see that I've included the requests library. And we're going to send that post request to the specific URL with headers of content type being application/JSON, and finally with payload data of the JSON version of this dictionary that we created. So let's say json.dumps, which is the way to turn a dictionary into JSON, and the payload. Cool. And then finally, just to make sure that we return something, I'm going to return r.content, which is just the content within that post request. Cool. So now that we save this, we have the code written to actually be able to send a message through Slack, but we're not actually sending anything yet because we don't actually have any of the code written in course enrollment to actually send that message. So let's go ahead and do that here. The first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to import the correct methods from Slack. It's create Slack message and post to Slack into teachable webhooks.py. So I'll do that at the top. I'll say from Slack import, and the two methods that we want to import are post to Slack and create Slack message. And then what we want to do is we want to take the data that we want to send through this message to create the message and then post that message to Slack. I'm just going to copy and paste the actual code for creating that message just because it's very specific to the message that I want to send here. And it's formatted in a specific way. But really what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding the name, email, course, and amount to Slack, which is what we see here, name, email, course, amount. And the way that we're going to do that is we're basically going to take the course enrollment data that has all this information already stored for us, and we're going to basically use that create Slack message method to parse out the right information that we want to send through that Slack message. And then once we've gotten that message, we want to take that message and post it to Slack, which will run here. And what we can see, let me press Control, Command Enter to run our code, which I believe is loading right now. And what we should see when we run Postman again is that if I were to go back to Slack, we just got a new message for that course enrollment, which is really cool. That message could be whatever you want. I made it a particularly fancy way, but it was really that simple just to create a message and send it through Slack's API, and we don't need Zapier to do it for us. The next step that we're going to take is, now that we've gotten their student in Mailchimp and we've sent a message that, hey, a new student signed up in Slack, let's take that information about that student and add it to a Google Sheet, which we'll use as a database for all the new students that sign up for our course. All right, everybody, we are getting to the final stretch of this course. We've set up a webhook that activates when a student signs up for a course in Teachable, added that student's information in Mailchimp, and then sent ourselves a Slack message notifying us that the student signed up. Now this final step is that we just want to take that student's info and add it to our Google Sheet. We're going to accomplish this by creating a new method called Update Data in Sheets. That's in this Google Sheets.py file. And this method is going to take two parameters. The first one is tab, which is going to signify the tab that we're going to add this data to. In my worksheet, it's going to be the signups tab. For you, it might be something different. And the second thing is going to be this data that we want to append to the data that already exists in that tab. And so to do this, we'll follow a couple of steps. The first is that we're going to authorize the Google Sheets API to work with our account credentials so we can interact with our account's workbooks. It's kind of like how you log into your Google account, then access the files that your account has access to. Next, we'll tell our code to navigate to the workbook and the tab within that notebook that we want to add the student's information to. After that, we'll get the data that's already in the tab, append the data to append to the existing data, and then make sure we're not adding duplicate rows, and finally put that data back into the tab. And kind of similar to Mailchimp, Google Sheets has an official API, which you can see here, and I linked to. There's also an unofficial API that someone built for us to make it easier to interact with the Google Sheets API in Python. And so before the next video, what I want you to do is just take one quick step to make sure that you have everything you need to authorize your Google Sheets account. If you go to the PyGSheets documentation and click on Authorizing PyGSheets, you'll see that it'll prompt you to go to the Google Developers Console, create an account and an application within that account. And then what you'll need to do is, I would personally follow this service account documentation just to follow along. And eventually, once you complete that, you'll get this file, this JSON file, that will have all your account credentials in it. Once you have that, you're going to drag that file, which is going to be named something like service account credentials.json, over into the left-hand pane here. You can just drag and drop it, and then we should be good to go. So I'll pause here just to let you get that authorization document, and then we will jump into actually writing our code in the next video. Let's go ahead and write the code to add our student data to our Google Sheet by following all the steps that we had just walked through. So we're going to create this new method, which we're going to call Update Data in Sheets. So I'll call it Update Data in Sheets, which is going to take two parameters. One is the tab that we actually want to update the data for in our Google Sheet. In my case, it's going to be this signups tab, but we'll specify that when we call the method. And the other is going to be the data that we want to append to the sheet. So data to append. Great. And the next thing we want to do is we want to follow these steps. So let me just add them as documentation. Here, we're going to comment them out. Let's add some space. Maybe add a little bit more. And let's indent that one to the right. Cool. Okay, so we want to authorize the Google Sheets API by using the PyGSheets.authorize method. And if you remember back to the last video, we had walked through the steps, or I at least told you how to do it. You were doing this on your own to get the service account credentials file, which is going to be a JSON file with all of your credentials for your personal account. Once you get that, drag and drop it or copy and paste it into your files directory on the left. I have it here. I'm not going to actually open it just so I don't expose any of my data, and I'm going to delete it after this video. But what we're going to do is we're going to use the parameter for the service account file in order to authorize our PyGSheets API. So let's go ahead and do that here. We're going to call our API instance GC, which I think is just common naming convention with PyGSheets. And I'm going to say that that is going to be equal to PyGSheets, which is the name of our package that allows us to interact with the Google Sheets API in Python, which we've imported here. Import PyGSheets. Great. And that's going to be .authorize. And the way we're going to authorize is we're going to say that we have this service account file at a specific path. And that path is going to be the dot is and the slash are basically saying it's in the current folder that we're currently in. And we're going to call this service account credentials.json. Cool. So we've now authorized the Google Sheet API to interact with all of the Google Sheets in our drive. And the next thing that we want to do is we want to tell our API that, hey, there's a specific workbook, this Like IM5 workbook, in my case, it's going to be something else for you, is the one that we want to work with. And specifically, I want to work with that signups tab. So what we're going to do first is we're just going to first define what that, the spreadsheet, the specific workbook that we want to interact with is. And the way you can figure that out, I'm just going to open up a blank spreadsheet so I don't expose this, is you can see in the link that you have this docs.google.com/spreadsheets/d, and then you have this big code to the right of it. And that code is going to be the ID of the specific workbook that you want. So I would copy and paste that here. I created it as an environment variable in my code. So I'm just going to say that the spreadsheet ID is going to be os.environ. And I named it LIF GSheets ID, which you can save it as whatever you want. You can hard code it into your code if you're the only one looking at this. It doesn't really matter, but that's just our way of being able to figure out which workbook, which spreadsheet we actually want to work with. And then from there, we need to tell our workbook to go to a specific sheet. And so what we want to do is we want to use this PyGSheets API in order to first open the spreadsheet that we have designated, and there's an open by key, which that key is that ID that we just found, which will allow us to open a spreadsheet from that specific key. So let's say that we want to get a specific sheet, which is going to be equal to GC, which is our API, that we're going to open by key, and the key that we're going to open is this spreadsheet ID. And then from there, what we can do is we can say, not only do I want to go within the specific Google Sheet, but I want to go to a specific tab. And the way that we're going to get to a specific tab, not from here, but from our PyGSheets directory, is that there is a worksheet by, let's see if I can find this. Title, where'd it go? Maybe I clicked into the wrong space. Let's see, worksheet by title. I guess you're just gonna have to take my word for it that there is a method in here that's called worksheet by title, which allows us to get a specific tab within a workbook from the title of that tab, which in our case is going to be signups, but we can dictate from this tab parameter here. So the worksheet that we're going to be working with is going to be sh.worksheet by title, and the title is going to be the tab variable that we're going to pass in. Great. So the next steps for our code are that we want to get the data that's already in the tab. We want to take the data that we want to append and add it to the existing data, then put it back in the tab. And the way that we're going to actually accomplish this is we'll start by getting all the contents of the current tab as a data frame. And I do a whole course on data frames through my data analysis course. You can learn more about it if you'd like to. For now, all you really need to know that it's effectively like a data table, kind of like this. You can do manipulations on, you can append data to it, you can analyze data within it. Not really important for now. The only thing that you need to really know is that PyGSheets offers a built-in getAsDF method that takes the contents of a specific worksheet and turns it into a pandas data frame, which is really handy for our purposes. Let's create a new variable called df, which will get by taking our worksheet, which is the signups tab, and we will get as df, And just to prove that we actually got the contents as a data frame, I'm going to press Command Enter. My computer is being a little slow, so it might take a second to run. We should see this disappear and turn into red text within the next, hopefully, few seconds. Here we go. All right, cool. So now when we go ahead and run this, we should see when we go back, nothing. Oh, nothing because we haven't actually imported this specific code into our teachable webhooks.py file. So let's go ahead and do that first, and then we can actually run our code to make sure that it's going to run properly. So let's say from Google Sheets, we're going to import update data in Sheets. Let me just make sure I wrote that correctly. Update data in Sheets. Great. And what we're going to do with that is we're going to update the data in Sheets for a specific tab, which is our signups tab, with specific data that we want to append, which is going to be our course enrollment data. So let me go ahead and run that just to make sure it's going to spend some time running. And while we're waiting for this to load, I'm just going to take some of the follow-up steps to append the data that we want to append to our data frame, remove the duplicate rows from that data frame, and add that updated DF to our tab. So to append this data, Pandas is a really easy built-in function to be able to do this. I'm going to create a new variable called updated DF, which is going to be our original DF that we're going to append the data to append to. And we're going to ignore the index that it's in. And now that this is up and running, let me just see if that data frame will actually load and print out here. Cool. Okay, so we can ignore the follow-up steps, but it's at least showing us this data frame here, which is great. And then from there, we just want to, I'll say that we want to exclude duplicate rows. So we'll say that this updated DF is going to be equal to itself, but dropping duplicates. And I'm going to drop duplicates on a subset that is only student email and the course name, because that should be sufficient. And then let's clear out all the contents. Let's say worksheet.clear, which if we were to go back into the documentation, we can see that there is a clear all values in worksheet function called clear. And then let's add the updated DF data to the tab. So we'll do that by saying updated or worksheet dot, and let's see how we actually put the data frame in here. So data frame, set the data frame, we'll load the sheet from the pandas data frame, worksheet dot set data frame, that's going to be updated DF. This next part's not super crucial, but effectively I'm just adding a couple parameters that we're going to see in this set data frame method. Now let's go ahead and run that. So I'm going to press Command Enter to run it. And just to make sure we return something, let me return updated DF now that we're done. Again, this might just take a few seconds, so we will hang tight while we're waiting for that to run. But what we should see at the very end is that this data that we currently have here is going to have one more row appended to it. It's going to have the new data for Matt Blank on top of just this first student that we already had in our system. I think I've got to start learning some jokes to kill time if this is going to keep happening. But assuming this runs properly, we're really on the right track. We are getting to a point where we are able to add a new member to Mailchimp. We're sending Slack messages. We're using Google Sheets. We can basically figure out how to line up and knock down any individual API that we want to interact with in order to actually update data from what we initially started with, the starting point of, hey, someone new signed up. Let's do all these follow-up steps. We could do things like send out a tweet to be like, hey, we're so excited that we got these new members. Literally anything your heart desires, you can basically set up and configure here. Now it looks like this is getting back up and running. So let me run this and let's watch this in action. We should see in a second, assuming that this ran properly, that this data is going to update and include a second row in it. So let's see if that worked. Yeah, we can actually see it updating in real time. Look how that disappeared. And now it added to it this additional row, this map blank 11@gmail.com, the course ID, the amount that I paid. Really cool that we were able to take all that information and add it here. So awesome. I'm going to pause this video right here. We just finished working with the Google Sheets API. You can loop through multiple sheets to add even more data, but I think this is a good place to stop. So I will see you in the finale where we will just wrap up this course and talk about how you can take this further on your own. And that is a wrap on the automations course. Awesome job. So we've spent the past hour together learning to write code in Python that connects Teachable, Mailchimp, Slack, and Google Sheets so that when a new student signs up for my course, their info gets added to Mailchimp, I get a Slack message, and then their data gets added to a Google Sheet. But the reality is that we didn't just learn to connect these 4 services for the sake of connecting these 4 services. What you really learn is that you can take any different service that has an API or a webhook and learn to connect them yourself and learn to tap into them. And that's a really powerful skill and something that will serve you really well as you continue coding on your own. Now, if you want to continue learning, then I do offer more courses in data analysis and web scraping, and am adding more courses all the time. I hope this is just the beginning of our journey learning to code together, and I can't wait to teach you in the next video.